Volume 1, Chapter 3, Dr. Frank. Like you, I'm also a Venn diagram of blood and body. I was born in West Texas by a white man and a brown woman from Jakarta. My father was an oil man. I know, right? And his father, and his father, and his father. They all came from Texas. And even though I enjoyed my childhood in certain ways, I still wanted to get out as quickly as I could. Perhaps you can relate. What twist of fate is it that I would end up back in the South? Nature is a funny thing, and home is still home, whether you want it to be or not, I suppose. My father was one of those typical white male species, imbued with devilish beauty and fetching looks that tend to go hand in hand with predation. Like a serial killer or a cult leader who captures so many white women as prey because their victims just can't believe someone that good-looking can be so monstrous until it's too late. Just a hair over 6 feet tall, his eyes 2 milky pools of periwinkle you could swim in to discover or lose yourself. He was naturally athletic, as men like that often are, and long and lean, and could eat whatever he wanted without worry he would add even an inch to his Adonis frame. My maternal grandmother cleaned houses and tended gardens for the richest in Indonesia, and by the time my mother was 10, her skin had already become a mixture of burnt umber and taupe from the sun that beat through her flesh, the heat that etched lines into the back of her neck as she bent over orchids, watering their radiant white blooms, stars against the expanse of lush greenery. As a child, my mother learned quickly how the different class levels in Indonesia read one another through the many shades of brown as she worked outside with her mother in houses palatal in scope, homes she'd never dreamed she'd inhabit one day. For the darker your skin is, the lower on the class strata you appear. It is more probable you work in the fields or outside. That's why so many Asians end up wanting to look like the paperwhites. That's the word my mother always used for the pale among her. The ones who were either the color of light sienna because they had money and didn't have to work outside like our family, or the whites that had migrated to the island to live out their retirements in paradise, flaunting the ease with which they performed the native in their western-marketed silk sarongs and kebayas as they enjoyed Sunday brunch downtown. Must be nice, Ma often thought to herself, watching as they shielded their pale skin from the hot tropical sun in their air-conditioned cars, while she and my grandmother toiled, kneading the dark soil in their fingers or forming circles with vinegar on the linoleum with their whole hands, crouching along on their knees. My mother named me Zoel, an Arabic name that signified a shining light. I've often wondered about the human obsession behind naming things, but lately I've grown more reflective about my mother's particular motivation behind my namesake. Whether her hopes for my future successes endowed me with a blessing or a curse. But there is time later to tell that part of the story. The privilege to name is a power in and of itself. I suppose that's why I renamed myself Dr. Frank. It wasn't only its obvious connection to Shelley's novel, a book that meant much to me, that informed how I conceived of creation and began my life's work. It was also a way to remind myself that what I wanted most of all, was to live an authentic life, straight and singular in purpose. In some ways, though, it is that stubborn insistence to only consider one path forward that's caused me the most damage. Too late to go back now, I guess. I also wanted to make sure my family could never find me. That didn't quite end up as I planned. Well, back to my father. So my father, and my father's father, and so on, for as far back as oil had been a pursuit that led one to endless riches, were all oilmen. Part of the lineage I inherited was inevitably born from not only this obsession with financial riches, but also this unthinking need to consume the earth, no matter the human cost. My father found himself traveling to Jakarta when some Malay executives who expressed interest in importing oil from the United States reached out to my father's company. They always sent my father to close the deals because he knew how to persuade others in a way that they didn't even realize they were being seduced by him. Something inborn. It can't be taught. One dinner meeting took place at the residence of the top oil tycoon in Indonesia. As it happened, my mother helped my grandmother manage the residence for many years. Having an intuition that my father would find her exotic beauty appealing, the tycoon asked my mother to cook and serve the dinner party. As he knew this was no ordinary evening, much was riding on my father's response to this business deal, the tycoon arranged for my mother to dress the part, providing her with a sarong woven with silk, the shade of marigold so fine as had never embraced her body before. He hired another woman to style her thick black hair, pulled away from her forehead with a bejeweled headpiece affixed with pearls and agate, adding just a hint of creamy powder and rouge on her cheeks, a smudge of kohl lining each eye. Like drinking an elixir, the evening infused my mother's veins with its hallucination of life away from the toiling of labor and struggle. She reveled in it, even if it were only for one night, sinking into the fairy tale she knew she would never inhabit beyond this evening. After all, yellow-haired princes don't come for dark-complexioned girls like her, with skin thick and taut from all her long hours, stripping the floors of its memories of past lives, hands covered in calluses and permanently tinged with the scent of bleach and ammonia, the dark, crusty soil coating the undersides of her fingernails. But even as a teenager, my mother was proud of the life she had built with my grandmother, whom she deeply loved, and had no complaints. She had long made her peace with the life for which she was destined. Then, suddenly, from this one night, my mother's life, and mine, although I didn't exist yet, changed forever. As the tycoon predicted, my father couldn't take his eyes off my mother. He drank as fast as he could from his glass of wine and dark sweet coffee. He deliberately dropped his napkin on the floor several times in a row, so there would be a reason for her to wait on him again and again, offering another opportunity for him to inhale the sweet scent of jasmine oil on her neck that lingered in the air each time she bent down to retrieve his fallen napkin, before retreating to the kitchen to fetch him a new one. The tycoon looked on the scene with satisfied bemusement, and offered to arrange a private meeting for my parents the following evening. My father, undoubtedly, was pleased to get my mother alone and all to himself without distraction. My mother, who was no fool, knew this meeting could lead to a marriage proposal, but most importantly, that it could give her a chance at the kind of life in which her future child would have the world at her fingertips, a chance for her mother to live out the rest of her days in comfort and rest. To my mother, it was a small price to pay. Or so she imagined. As she lay in bed that night, while her mother softly snored beside her, my mother dreamed about the businessman's eyes, those deep blue pearls. Despite herself, she'd become hypnotized by his white beauty and all it promised, the gifts she was convinced would await her in this new life. It would take some time to uncover all the darkness lying behind the illusion of immaculate perfection. My father was very successful by the time he met my mother, and there existed quite a considerable age gap between them, 10 years, maybe more. He must have been close to 30 by then. My parents were always very evasive about their respective ages, but I was able to discern a guess from other details they presented when asked nonchalantly enough. My mother was still a teenager when they met, but old enough to be considered marrying age in Indonesia. In Jakarta, she'd grown accustomed to stories she heard when she and her mother went to the market for the week's meals about marriages, arranged for convenience and financial security by the families of the bride and groom, typically in less modern cities. In fact, in rural Indonesia, it was far more unusual to hear of a love marriage. Typically, Love happened only by accident in arranged marriages, a circumstance that developed after a couple cohabitated and raised children together long enough to grow on each other. My father was an American, and to my mother, and most born and raised in Indonesia and Malaysia, living in America was the pinnacle of ambition. It was where, if you were comfortable enough to land in my mother's station in life, or its equivalent, you hoped to eventually find yourself. All my mother knew was that this marriage would afford her family everything it could ever want and assure her children would be comfortable and successful long after she and her mother took their last breaths. It was through the American world of independence and fortitude my mother would learn the land of riches and dreams didn't apply to everyone, especially foreigners in a borrowed land. The evening after the night my parents first met, the tycoon arranged for my mother, styled again to perfection, paid for by the tycoon, to meet my father at the tycoon's private jet, just the two of them and the tycoon's own personal pilot. And my parents were off on a quick jaunt to Singapore, where my parents strolled the hawker center and my mother enjoyed a feast of her favorite Malay and classic Chinese dishes with a Singaporean twist. Chui ku, steamed rice cakes topped with dried shrimp and garlic, rojak, a sweet and sour salad with a fried bread topped with shrimp and satay sauce, and a Singaporean take on biryani. My father had been in the oil business long enough to know the way my mother's, or any other Asian woman's, acceptance of his potential wedding proposal was through her belly's predilections. When my father asked my mother questions about her family and her childhood, like a flower beholden to the sun, my mother would bow her head demurely as she told him about how her mother taught her to cook and clean, and garden and work her hands towards a purpose of providing for her home, where she lived a simple life with her mother. She told him about her mother then, how she hoped one day she could work enough hours so her mother could rest her aching joints without worrying where the rice for their daily meals would come from. Enough hours to make the fish they seldom bought to calm the rumble in their bellies a regular occurrence instead of an occasional luxury. My father nodded, taking in all the details my mother provided as he calculated in his head the risks and rewards of such an investment. My mother didn't include anything about her hobbies or other interests, like the portraits and landscapes she brought to life with watercolor on her rare days off, the weekly Malay calligraphy practice she cultivated each week as meditation. She knew the American wasn't interested in anything other than what she could offer as a dutiful wife. He smiled at her ravenous appetite, the way she demurely covered her mouth while answering his questions as bits of prawn and juices rebelliously fell from her mouth. By the time the wheels of the jet connected with the concrete runway back in Jakarta, the constellations swimming in the hot black sky, my father had made up his mind to ask for my mother's hand in marriage. There was no doubt in his mind she would accept. The following day, my father and the tycoon met for brunch at a restaurant in town, where they could finish negotiations regarding the business deal my father had traveled such a long distance to conduct with him. But, as the tycoon had hoped, now my father had a slightly different wager in mind. He would ask for my mother's hand in marriage as part of his bargaining currency. My grandfather had died of lung cancer when my mother was a young child, so there was no one else from whom to seek permission. Certainly, no one believed my grandmother held such authority since, as he saw it, she also owed her future livelihood to the tycoon. Having agreed to the exchange of business and marriage, the deal was done. My father extended his trip to tidy up some loose ends, and within a week, both my mother and grandmother began to pack the few possessions they couldn't bear to leave behind, preparing to join my father on the long voyage to Texas.